The great strength or advantage of thinking about church as an ecosystem is it just gets us connecting all the bits that we generally think of as disconnected. So when you're a pastor or when you're a leader or really anyone in church, we tend to think of church kind of like chicken McNuggets. They're all entirely separate pieces and they bear no relation to the other, whereas church is much more joined than that. And what can tend to happen is there are bits of church that we're very passionate about or that make a lot of noise or are causing us problems or that people really encourage us to focus on. And then there are other bits of church that we tend not to pay very much attention to. For years in our church, on a Friday morning, we had a mums and bubs play group that had about, I think, 20, 25 mums and bubs coming along. And I never actually went to it. And it wasn't that I didn't care about it. It's just that it didn't occur to me that it needed any particular attention from me. What ecosystem thinking does is say, no, that ministry is going to affect the rest of your church. Church is interconnected, and every part of our ministry will affect every other part of our ministry for good or ill. Now, as it happened, that particular ministry of mums and bubs had a big effect on our mission area. Lots of those women ended up coming along to Life Our Mission thing, and I just never realised it, and I never appreciated it. If I'd had my ecosystem thinking hat on, I would have said, no, this is an area of ministry in our church. It's going to be either adding heat or taking away from it. I need to think about church holistically, because everything works together. Now, to give you a sense of that, what I want you to do is to get into groups of 5 people. I want each of you to pick one part of the ecosystem, and I want you to argue for 45 seconds, only a minute at the top. I want each of you to argue why your part of the ecosystem is more indispensable than the others. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes. Each of you pick one part of the ecosystem on mission, serving others. Your job is to convince the others why your part of the ecosystem is more indispensable than the others. Okay, put up your hand if you're finished. These guys have. Down the front has as well. Okay, if you haven't finished, you're too slow. What I'm hoping happened there is no one won. Unless someone was just really powerfully convincing and you're like, yeah, blow the ecosystem, we're going to be all about ministry now. Generally, when we do that exercise, what happens is people get really passionate about their area, and then they realize that no, every area is indispensable, and in fact, every area relies on each other in order to succeed. And that really is what ecosystem thinking is all about. And in fact, if you are going to get anything out of this seminar, and I'm hoping you'll get more than this, really the one thing I'd want to say is the great benefit of ecosystem thinking is it forces you to constantly be thinking about the whole of your ministry and how everything is affecting each other. That is, it's as much a mindset as anything else. It stops you getting tunnel vision and just focusing on preaching if that is your thing, or just focusing on growth groups if that is your thing. As leaders, and this isn't just true of me as the senior pastor, but I want all of our senior staff caring about all of the parts of the Pentagon, every part of our church ecosystem. It's a way of thinking as much as anything else. But the first thing I want to say to you is the ecosystem is actually just a little bit more complex than just those 5 things. I studied marine biology at uni, and one of the things that we learned was it's a mistake if you oversimplify an ecosystem, that if you don't realise all of the things that are affecting it, and your church is actually more complex than just these 5 things. Now, when you think about it, these 5 things are passions that we'll have for people. So we want our people to be serving others. We want our people to be on mission and loving God and so forth. They're also passions that we have for our entire church as a group of people. And for lots of us, there are ways that we have organised our church in ministry teams. Now, some people will do it with the 5 M's, other people will do it with any number of different words that get used. But if you like, this diagram can be a way of just looking at ministry teams. The thing is, our church is more complex than ministry teams because those 5 areas are going to be expressed often across more gatherings. So I'll draw, for us, I'm at a church called Hunter Bible Church. We have Garden Suburb AM, we have Garden Suburb PM, Garden Suburb is just a suburb of Newcastle. We have Uni Church, and we have the City, which at the moment is PM, and we're in the process of planting City AM. These 5 areas with their ministry teams get expressed across 4 and soon 5 congregations. And so it's not as simple as saying, how is the serving others area going? How is it going in these 4 areas? Which means that immediately you've got an exponential increase in complexity in your church, right? The person who's running this could be superb and yet failing at 2 of the 4 because of the team that's there. And so we need to understand that our ecosystem is more complex than just those 5 things. There's also the gatherings. What makes it even more complex is that our church, the thing about the flock is they don't just gather where we tell them to. They're not that obedient. There are also people groups within our church. And these are groups of people. The way I define a people group is a group of people who have enough uniqueness in terms of their needs and uniqueness in terms of their opportunities. So they're unique enough and also sizable enough to form a block. And often a block that actually identifies itself. They say, we are this group of people in church. And so thinking about our church, we have a people group of youth. And the thing is, there are youth in all 4 congregations. But they wouldn't say they necessarily belong to the congregations. They would say they belong to youth. That's where their identity is. We also have a really large group of students. And again, you go, well, aren't they just at uni church? No, lots of our students will go to the other congregations, but they would see themselves as part of the student ministry, and a bunch of those are overseas students. We have mums. We have kids. We actually have a whole group of older people. We call them next phase. Sometimes they get called last phase. And again, next phase people are in literally all 4 of our congregations. But if you like, their first allegiance, their first kind of loyalty and identity within our churches, I'm part of the oldies group because they all get together for coffee and they all hang out and they all do things on a Wednesday morning. And at that point you might go, well, Greg, why mums and not dads? Well, it's interesting. This is where the uniqueness in terms of need and opportunity comes in. We've got pretty much as many dads as we do mums, but the mum's lifestyle creates unique needs and unique opportunities that the dad's doesn't. So by and large, dads don't view themselves as a unique and as a particular identity group, whereas our mums do. Because they're often at home, they're often somewhat isolated and so they band together. They're often better at things like evangelism and they work together in that. Dads, by and large, don't tend to form a people group, but mums very much do. I think there's also something about that desire to join and find support. And so within your church, your ecosystem is actually more complex, than just these 5, if you like, ministry areas or ministry passions. It's them expressed across however many gatherings you have, and also there are people groups where people see themselves really more part of this than any of that first. You can see why your church gets more and more complex as you get bigger. Adding one congregation does not just add a gathering on a Sunday. It adds 5 new ministry teams and potentially a whole bunch of complexity in terms of people groups. But if you just had one congregation, you'd say, well, actually our ecosystem still exists, but it is a little bit simpler and we might only have 2 or 3 people groups within it. But even within one congregation, there still will be 2 or 3 people groups, won't there? What I want you to do is just take a few minutes to draw what the ecosystem would look like for you. So for this, it's going to be pretty much the same for all of us, although you'll certainly have different names for your areas of ministry. Your congregations, you might only have 1, you might have 6. It might take a little bit more thought to think, what are these, if you like, self-identifying people groups where there's enough uniqueness and enough of them for them to go, yeah, I kind of find my group there in church. Take a few minutes and draw your church's ecosystem. I'm hoping you've had enough time to do that. This is the hard one, isn't it? Trying to figure out what would be a group of people that has enough uniqueness about them and there's enough of them that they kind of form a group. Scott asked me why I wouldn't just put kind of the, if you like, starting with babies, moving right the way up to older people. It's because sometimes people groups have nothing to do with age. It could be that you have a large group of asylum seekers in your church and they have unique needs and opportunity and there's enough of them that they'll band together. It occurred to me recently, we have 27 people on staff. That's a people group. In our church. The 27 staff actually form a group of people who identify in together and we're this kind of band of brothers. And so it's not just a demographic thing. It's looking into your church and saying, what are the groups of people where they do band together independent of congregation and independent of ministry team? And if I forget them, that they exist, I'm actually going to run into problems. Interestingly, I'll talk about this in a little bit. Older people for us was a slowly emerging group. So we launched essentially as a uni church, and I was only 26 and we didn't have kids. We had one person over 50 for the first 6 years of our life. And then gradually, older people began to join. And it was only when they sent a representative to me and they kind of came to say, Greg, we just kind of feel unloved. And he said this beautiful thing. He said, Greg, I just want to know who's going to bury me. Which I thought, oh, that's so beautiful. I said, not me. I do other things. No. But it was interesting. They sent a delegate. They'd formed a people group. And the thing is, the reason we didn't notice them is they were literally scattered through all of them. But then we sat down and we looked and we went, wow, there's 60 or 70 of them now. And now there's, 150 of them or so. That people group had been disguised by the gatherings. So there is a picture of what Hunter Bible Church's ecosystem looks like. I'm hoping you've now got a picture in front of you of what your church's ecosystem looks like. And as I said, immediately, we're now one step ahead because you know that you have to keep an eye on all of it. Your job as the senior pastor and the leadership team is to be aware and to be actively shepherding all of those people and to be aware of the effect that each part of your ecosystem has on the rest of the ecosystem, and to make sure that all of it is healthy. Automatically, what this is doing is broadening our thinking and actually forcing us to be more comprehensive, to not ignore bits of our ministry, to not ignore that Friday Mums group. Now, how do we use this in a practical way? I've got 6 ways that we can use this. Really, 2 of them are the major ones. The rest are just kind of cream on the cake. There are 6 ways that we use ecosystem thinking in our church. And before we begin to look into them, what I'd want to say is ecosystem thinking is a slightly more right brain activity than pathway thinking. So we've used the pathway a lot, and I actually use pathway thinking every single day in my ministry life. And pathway thinking, if you've looked at the pathway, it's pretty linear. You move from left to right and it's very analytical. Ecosystem thinking is a bit more creative. It's a bit more inexact. You're forming a hypothesis about how things might be joined and connected. And because of that, we don't actively have ecosystem meetings weekly. We tend to do them, kind of monthly, bi-monthly, and particularly when we see an issue that we think, could this be an ecosystem problem? So it's more creative. It means that sometimes you'll get to the end of it and you go, I still don't know. I'm going to share with you one of the challenges in our congregation. It took us about a year to think and to find the answer for why that congregation wasn't working, because it is that hypothetical kind of thinking. Okay.
Can you just draw a pathway when you say pathway thinking?
Right.
In the bottom corner, maybe.
Yep.
What do you mean by pathway?
Scott's just asked me to do pathway. There are actually videos on this, aren't there?
Yeah, there are videos. And
yep.
I'll share them once I get made an administrator of the thing.
So very quickly, the pathway is moving from awareness, where they know who we are, but we don't know who they are, to first contact, where we now know who they are. For non-Christians, people who aren't saved at that point, we're hoping that they then will be converted and followed up. And then we want them to join church. For people who are Christians, we're hoping that they'll join well. So JW, sometimes that's called integration. We want them to join well. We want them to become part of the family life of church. And we want them to grow in their relationship with God. We want them to serve. And then for most people, we're going to want to send them. Australia is a very fluid country. Most churches lose 12 to 15% of their church population every year. And so the pathway is people's walk with us through church. And you can see that that's doing that kind of analysis, it's very helpful, but it is kind of logical and analytical. Pathway thinking is more creative. It's more I wonder. It's less guaranteed in terms of you getting the right answer. Did you want to jump up?
I'm just going to do your PowerPoint slides.
Okay.
Put your key headings up on the board as you talk.
All right. Good.
You can do that on PowerPoint, Greg. It's really useful.
Everybody give me a hand. No. The first thing we can use ecosystem thinking for, and to be honest, I think this is the key one, is clearly diagnosing a problem that we've seen in church. So sometimes you can see that an area of church is not working. That is, you mightn't be hitting the goals that you've set. So you set a goal for, say, 25 people to join church across this year, or for a certain number of growth group leaders to be raised up. There's a goal that you haven't reached it. It could be that it's an area of church where people are complaining. So you're getting feedback from people that it's not working. It could just be that you have a vague sense that this is not working, but you're not quite sure why. What ecosystem thinking does is help you to clearly diagnose what is the problem, because often the problem is not as simple as it appears. Let me give you a couple of scenarios about how this can be the case. There was a fellow that I was good friends with. He was pastoring a church, and he had a problem that was, this is where I'm going to be annoying. Can you just flip over?
Yeah.
He had a problem that he was feeling in community. That is, people were coming to him and saying, you're not visiting us, and so we don't feel loved. So they had a problem here in community. And he said, so what I'm thinking about doing is instituting a visiting program. And we said, well, before we do that, why don't we do a little bit more thinking about this from the point of view of an ecosystem? And so we began to look into the other parts of the Pentagon. And what we discovered is that particular congregation, it was their morning congregation, that particular congregation had the least mission heat of any of their congregations. He couldn't remember the last time anyone was saved. And so immediately, of course, if you've got a group of people who aren't passionate about mission, what are they going to do? They're going to start wondering, do I belong? Am I being loved? And so we thought, oh, well, that's really interesting. The problem is more complex than just not visiting. Then we talked about deep in the Word, and he said, well, yeah, actually, Greg, it's the congregation that has the lowest attendance in growth group, the lowest joining rate in growth groups. So I think it was under 50% of that congregation belonged to a growth group. And when I said, so why is that the case? It's because they hadn't been training growth group leaders. And so he said, well, rather than institute a visiting thing, maybe you don't have a community problem. Maybe what you have is a mission problem and a serving problem. And if we can get mission humming in your church, and if we can start training growth group leaders to lead those groups where people will be loved, maybe you don't need to do this. Across the course of the next year, those were the two things that we focused on working on together. This problem disappeared. It was being felt in community, but it wasn't a community problem. And so what ecosystem thinking does, if we hadn't thought about the totality of it, he would have just instituted a visiting program, and people would still have been complaining to this day, because you can never love people enough to actually fill their tank. And so that's one example of it. Another example from our own church, one of our congregations, we noticed that it had dropped mission heat. It was a congregation that had been, it was down at Lake Macquarie. It had been traditionally a really evangelistic congregation, and when we ran our life course, the numbers for this particular life course were really low, and we actually just couldn't detect much excitement about mission in the congregation. And so we thought, well, do we want to then really drill into this, have a series on evangelism, talk to people a lot about heaven and hell? When we did some thinking about it, again, within the ecosystem, what we realised was that congregation had actually grown by 20% in the previous year. And what most people were saying is they just didn't belong. They didn't know anyone, and they felt naturally reluctant to invite people along to a church where they didn't feel connected themselves. And they weren't particularly aware of that logic, but we had to draw those pieces together. Interestingly, as soon as we did, we started putting on a whole bunch of dinners after church, and before you knew it, mission heat increased because people invite people to a church where they feel like their friends are going to be loved. That is, if we'd pulled this lever, it would not have worked, because the problem wasn't here. The problem was over here. I'll give you one last example, again from our church. One of our congregations, it was an afternoon congregation. We noticed a couple of things. One, it was the congregation that was most likely to grumble and complain. It was the problem child of all of our congregations. And it was also the one where the loving God aspect of that congregation really suffered. It was so hard to preach to that congregation. They gave you nothing. It was a congregation where the singing was least passionate, where the attendance at church was the lowest, and it was particularly, it was pre-COVID to a degree, but really it was coming out of COVID. We noticed that it was the slowest congregation to come back, and it was the one that was weakest. And so we were thinking, is this something to do with they're not passionate about church? Do they not love God? Is it that none of them are thinking about? So we looked at each of the ministry teams, and they were actually amazing. And in fact, the ministry team for Loving God, that particular band, for instance, that particular congregation had more gifted, accomplished, and passionate musicians than any of the other congregations. And it had exceptional MCs, and it was the same preachers preaching there, so clearly the standard of the preaching was just amazing. What is the problem here? The problem was actually in the people groups. That particular congregation was full of young families, and it had very few older people. It had much fewer students. And basically these young families were at the hardest and most selfish time of life. The other thing that made it really hard is just going into COVID, a baby died in that congregation of a cold, a common cold. And the baby died. The parents of that child, who I met with all the way through COVID, and they love the Lord and they're with Him, but COVID happened before they could come back to the congregation. And so as that congregation full of young families went into COVID, they were so incredibly anxious, and they just didn't have the older people there to say it's going to be okay. That is, the issue had nothing to do with godliness. It wasn't because they didn't love the Lord. It was actually just to do with the age, to do with the people group, and therefore to do with the human maturity as much as anything else. It took us a year to figure that out. It took so long because we were saying each of these ministry teams is actually doing really well. And the other congregations, this problem isn't being replicated in the other congregations. What is it with this congregation? And the more we looked at it, the more we realised it's actually just the makeup of the congregation. For us, praise God, as we move towards a building program, we actually were able to rejig our congregations. That congregation has had a whole bunch of older people flushed into it. It is a new group. It's totally different, simply because we changed the people groups. Yep. So there's three, I've given you three examples of how ecosystem thinking helped us to identify what was the problem. Now, before I stop for questions, let me give you the methodology of how we go about doing this. Here is how we tend to run this kind of conversation to work it out. The first thing we do is we'll try and diagnose or at least verbalize the problem in the clearest language we can, and we'll provisionally come up with a where are we feeling this problem most? Not where does it lie, but where are we feeling this problem most? So are we feeling it in mission? Where are we noticing this problem lying? That's the first thing we do. The second thing we'll do is we'll say, okay, let's look into that area in that congregation, and we'll ask questions around what we call OPPE. O is the outcome. Have we set goals? Are they reaching it? Culturally, is our congregation on board with this? Let's look at the sense of the outcome. Have we set goals? Are people on board? Then we'll say, who are the people there? The leader, the team. So when that congregation was struggling for mission, we were saying, well, in that congregation, who have we got running mission? Are they good? Have they got a good team? Is it simply a problem of leader and team? Then we'll look at the program. What are we running there? Is it working? Does it not work for that particular group of people? So for that mission congregation, the congregation that was struggling with mission, we run life, and we were saying, is life just at the wrong place for them? Is it at the wrong time? Is there something about it that's not working for them? Do we need to change our program? And then the last thing is just performance. What do the numbers actually tell us? We have a sense that there's no mission going on. Do the numbers actually confirm it? And so having one located where we're feeling the problem, then we'll say, well, okay, let's dig into this area of the ecosystem and ask, is the outcome healthy? Are the people healthy? Is the program good? What do the numbers tell us in performance? What we found when we did that at that Lake Mac congregation is actually there were great people and the program was working really well, but for some reason the congregation weren't on board. What that forces us to do is to say, well, if the answer isn't immediately found here, is it found in any of the other areas there? So let's do the same analysis for the other ministry areas with OPPE within that congregation. If we discover, like we did with the grumpy congregation, we discover actually all 5 areas are working well, we'll say, well, how widespread is this problem in our church? Are we having the same problem in the other gatherings? And if we discover that we are having the same problem in the other gatherings, well, that helps us to see that probably the problem lies above here, that we have a culture problem in general that we're going to have to deal with. If we find that it's not happening in other congregations, or even if it is, that forces us to think, well, is this actually a people group? Essentially what we're doing is starting narrow and moving out. What is the problem? Where are we feeling it? Well, let's dig into that area. Okay, let's dig into the other areas of the Pentagon. let's look at how widespread the problem is in church, and let's see if it's a product of a particular people group, you can see that really all we're doing is experimenting, running a thought experiment of how is all of our church affecting this. That's how we go about it. All right, why don't you stop, chat with a person next to you. Are there questions you'd like to ask, comments that you'd like to make? Okay. So just running through the methodology I gave you before you ask questions.
Just don't push too hard.
We're feeling a problem there. So is the problem there? Have we got a problem with the people, with the program, with the culture? Have we not set goals? Is the problem actually somewhere else in that congregation, in one of the other ministry teams, and that's causing it? Is it widespread within our congregations, across our different gatherings? Or is it unique to that gathering? Is it actually a people group that's affecting this? So we're kind of just moving out and we're just having a thought experiment along the way. Sometimes it takes 20 minutes. Sometimes it takes a year. Because you can see with a church ecosystem that's this complex, sometimes the problem is actually very complex. It takes a year to work out. All right, questions or comments that people have? Great questions, kind of the homogeneous unit. So Scott's question was, I talked about that congregation not having older people. Sometimes our congregations are fairly narrow. So we have a uni church. I think what that's helped me to do is to realise that some homogeneous units will actually work really well for a period of time. So our uni church is a wonderful congregation to go to. They're there for 5 or 6 years at a really exciting time of life where they've got lots of energy, they've got expanding friendship systems. It's great. That homogeneous unit works. I think, at least in our context, a homogeneous unit that is all young families where everyone is sleep deprived and stressed and missing university days and missing singleness, that was a homogeneous unit that just did not work. And it might be that you're thinking, but it does work for us, and that's great. I think different places are different. So yeah, it did shape my thinking about homogeneous units, that not all of them are necessarily the easiest group to be homogeneous with. Yeah. Other questions or comments? Great question. That's a really good question. So we're asking lots of questions. We're throwing hypotheses at a problem that we can feel. And sorry, what was your name? Winnie asked, this is going to take quite a lot of time. Who invests the time? I invest the time at the level of wondering and noticing. So I'm generally the one who comes to our senior leadership team and says, I think we have a problem here, because it's my job to notice, it's my job to wonder. Then the leadership team will invest combined time thinking and plotting and really throwing the answer at it. And what I've generally found is these discussions can last for about an hour at a time. People are just exhausted after an hour of that kind of creative thinking. But if there's 8 people in the room, that's 8 hours that we've just invested in it. It is quite a lot of time, which means that we wouldn't do this every week. We do it when we can see that there is a problem that we just can't see the obvious answer to. You know what I mean? It's when we think that there could be more to this than just that leader's not doing their job. And so it's the sort of thing we'll do once a month. We'll do when we've got that kind of decision to make. Whereas pathway thinking, you can do a good pathway analysis in 25 minutes. It's much simpler. Yeah.
I just on that, so you what you want us.
That's just a really great question, because what you've done is tap into the reality of ministry life. We're time poor. We don't want to pull the wrong lever, because what that will do is actually just waste more people time and money, waste more resource and energy, and potentially hurt people. For me, I'm always trying to work out, how do I maximise in each area of our congregation the health of these 4 things, OPPE. O is the outcome. I'm trying to maximise clarity around we've set goals, and clarity around there is cultural buy-in here. So I'm maximising the sense that our church is on mission and they love mission and so on. I'm trying to maximise the health of the people, so we're investing in leaders and we're investing in teams. I'm trying to maximise the health of the program. We're trying to improve the program and we're also measuring the performance. Those 4 Ps are my go-to all the time. I'm just obsessed with how is the culture for each of the 5 areas of the ecosystem? How are the leaders? How are the teams? So a couple of our staff are here. Andrew's here. Every time Andrew and I meet, I'm there going, okay, do you think that Andrew works in youth and kids? Do you think that people are valuing this? How are your leaders? How are your team? How's the program going? Is it on board? If we work really hard at these 5 things week on week, by and large our church will be healthy. And we won't need to do the big ecosystem intervention. But there'll be certain things where you go, no matter how hard we work at those 4 things in mission, if the problem is over here, it won't have fixed it. So day in, day out, I'll work on those. When it's not working, when it's not fixing it, I will do the ecosystem thing. In the meantime, with that congregation that we had that loves God problem, you know, they were grumpy and singing was terrible, we worked at OPPE, and I just kept thinking and praying and watching and asking people in the congregation and going, is it just me? And talking to the staff about it. And I was determined not to land too quickly on a diagnosis because I had the OPPE things that I was working on anyway. Yeah. Lou. Great question. Do we have separate teams for each of those 5 areas? When we first began to sort of operate in these areas, we didn't have enough staff to run each of those 5 areas. We had people double hatting, and then gradually they built teams within them. And so if you were in a church that was one congregation and you had 3 leaders, I think you would have the 3 leaders across the 5 areas if that's the way you wanted to run ministry, and then you would gradually build teams and you find the next leader for each of the areas out of the team. That's the way we would do it. We now have...
What do you mean by double hatting?
Double hatting means doing 2 jobs. And so it's really common in a church plant situation for the planter to be being the senior pastor or the only pastor and running all 5 of those areas. I was chatting with one of the guys here, Dave Martin, who he planted down at Reservoir, and that was the thing. He was kind of doing all 5 of those areas, and now they've grown to that point where he's trained up people, and it doesn't necessarily need to be. In fact, it simply can't be paid staff in all of them initially, because paid staff are really expensive. There are some areas in our church that ministry still doesn't have a person who works only full-time in it for us. So you start off having people double hat, they then build teams. Out of those teams comes the leader. Church growth is slow there. You build the health. If you like, I've come to believe that the way churches grow healthily is you grow the skeleton, not the flesh. That is, you can just add numbers on a Sunday, but unless the skeleton is there, the teams of people who are going to love them and the people looking after the area, those people won't stick because people won't stay in a church where they're not loved. And so often you'll see churches, they'll grow and then bounce back and grow and then bounce back and grow and bounce back. And that's because the flesh is growing, not the skeleton. The teams and the leaders on the left-hand side aren't there. It's why you would move slowly before you would plant a second congregation. Because when you plant a second congregation, you're adding a whole 5 extra areas of complexity. And yes, it opens up a new door, but it opens up new load as well. I'm not sure if that answers your question, Lou, but yeah. We do. Yeah, we will have one leader. We now have, in our context, we have someone who oversees, say, Deep in the Word, Richard, and he has teams in each of those congregations. Yep. Yeah.
Just quickly related, does everyone in your church know that you're an ecosystem 5
different churches approach this differently. So we work with the 5 M's, and for us, we go, here are 5 things that we think God is absolutely passionate about.
So when do you say that?
As people join. That's the way we do it. Other churches, it's very much a back room thing. For us, we went, well, we want people to be passionate about it because we think that each of these 5 areas have theological value and freight, and they're really great pastorally. I want people who join our church to be committed to these things. It makes sense that I'll then have leaders for them and teams for them, but it means we're very upfront. Other churches who operate with the same thing, it's very back room. It's more just about how they run ministry. Great question. How intentional are we about who goes to congregations? We say anyone can go to any of our congregations, everyone is open, but we will tap people on the shoulder and say, would you, along with these other 4 couples, would you be willing to go to a different congregation? So at the beginning of this year, we shut 3 congregations and launched 3 entirely different congregations. We let everyone choose. And behind the scenes, we tapped on the shoulder, I'm thinking 30 couples in the end that we had deliberate conversations with. So for us, we give the illusion of entire freedom.
Is there a sort of demographic focus within that tapping of?
Yep. Yeah. This congregation, we wanted more old people, and so we tapped a whole bunch of older people on the shoulder, our Garden Suburb PM congregation, and we got a whole bunch of people from AM to go along to that. We also had to tap some of the young people on the shoulder because we didn't want that congregation to get too big, and we sent them back to AM. We'll talk to uni churches and send them into the city or across to AM. That is, I think it's perfectly fine to have a conversation where you say, here is a need, I would love you to be part of it. We have part of the solution. What we've generally found is people move best in cohorts. And so people would go with 5 friends. That's when people stick, generally. Okay, just in terms of time, yeah, we've got to move on. The rest of them really are icing on the cake. The second big value of using ecosystem thinking is it helps us to predict the effects of the decisions that we're making. So this is kind of the flip side of the first one. The first one is we've got a problem, where is it coming from? The flip side is we're making an action here, what might the effect be? If we move someone from this congregation to that congregation and out of this ministry team and into that ministry team, what is the effect going to be? If we close this congregation, what is the effect going to be on people groups? That is, if you like, we're saying we're about to tap here. We're about to go boom. Where will the reverberations be felt? If we move a key leader out of youth, what are the reverberations going to be? And again, it's the creative thinking, because you don't know, you're trying to predict the future, but we found it to be very helpful. The third way that we use ecosystem thinking is identifying opportunities for growth and for new ministries. So I mentioned that for us, we started with very few older people, and in fact, the older people that we had, so older people, were scattered through there, which meant that we didn't realise that we were growing in them. The way we realised that we were growing in them is by doing some ecosystem thinking where we said, well, who actually is in the older people? Have we got enough of them? And then we realised that we needed to start a ministry simply for them. Okay, the fourth way we use it is in balancing and allocating resource. So remember I said resource in church is people, time, people who spend time, and often that costs money. Ecosystem thinking can help us to balance where we put resource. So there are some classic mistakes that happen in church where we throw all of our resource into one area. In the kind of church tradition that I come from, anytime you get someone who is a mature Christian who seems to know what they're doing and can handle the Bible, you throw them into becoming growth group leaders. What does that do to your loving God team? Well, it means that all of the most godly musicians are now growth group leaders, and so is it any wonder that our bands are going crazy because all the most mature people aren't in the bands anymore? And so what ecosystem thinking does is say, okay, how do we balance mature Christians across our ecosystem, and in fact, perhaps across all of our gatherings as well? One of the things that this is really helpful for is starting to negate, if you like, the effect of your super recruiters. Our youth pastor, his name is Pete Monday, is just one of the best recruiters I have ever seen. He is spectacular at bringing people into youth. And at one point, we kind of looked and we were like, every single person who is of quality in our uni church ministry is leading at youth. Isn't any wonder that the uni church is really struggling? And so what ecosystem thinking does is say, well, as we look across here, have we got a balance of resource? Are our mature, gifted, experienced people spread well across our ministry? And so ecosystem thinking is helpful for that. The next one, point 5, it's just helpful for seeing the complexity of communication in decision making. So you're making a decision in church. How often do we make decisions in church and we go, okay, so we've made this decision. Who needs to know? Well, just this group of people. And then we realise that a whole bunch of other people have been affected and we never communicated it to them. And so as you're making a big decision or any kind of significant decision with your senior team, saying, we're making a decision that initially affects this group, how will it affect the others and who do we need to communicate with? And is there a people group that's going to be particularly affected? Who do we need to talk to? Ecosystem thinking just forces us to think through our communication lines better. The sixth thing that it helps for is just unifying our team. One of the things that can happen is in any size church, but it particularly becomes a problem as your church gets bigger, is the idea of siloing. Patrick Lencioni talks about siloing, which is where I really just care about my thing. I just care about youth, or I just care about growth groups in one congregation. The more we can get our leaders recognizing that our church has this level of complexity, the more that they realize how much they need each other, and the more they begin to care about everyone else, and the more it really just expands their heart and expands their minds. We have found when I employ senior staff, what I'll say to them is, your first job is not to be working in mission. Your first job is you're an ecosystem pastor. That is, I'm employing you to care about this whole thing. And you might be working in mission in one congregation, but your job is actually the whole thing. And I want you to feel the weight of anywhere that is struggling. That is, you might be working in mission in one congregation, but if kids in a different congregation is struggling, I want you to own that. And I want you to feel it. And ecosystem thinking we've found that it really has gelled our team together. It's stopped them from siloing. Yep. Yeah. Okay. Two things we've got left to do. One, we'll go for some fairly quick questions. But while I'm answering questions, last year we did this. It's kind of risky, but I'm willing for us to have a crack at it. It might be that you have a problem in your church at the moment that you just can't quite diagnose. You're thinking, we're not quite sure what it is, but we're feeling this area is underperforming. If you're willing, if you're brave, you can come out on stage. So Rowan Hillsden did it last year. Rowan's a pretty confident guy. And so he was happy to come out. And what we can do is to start to work through where are you feeling it? Let's talk about that ministry. Let's talk about the other areas. If you're brave, I'm going to open up that opportunity. If no one volunteers, I'll get you guys to talk about it in small groups, which is actually much safer. It's riskier for me, though, because if I can't diagnose the problem, then I look like an idiot. So what questions have you guys got about those 6 things? Okay, so if we're looking to recruit people into leadership, is there one particular area that is more strategic, or do we generally just work with people's gifts and skills? Okay, on the premise that you've got none at the moment. Probably what I'd say is our goal is to consistently build the whole of the skeleton. So that's the basic premise. We're looking to build health in all 5 areas across our congregations, and so we're looking to do that. What I have generally found is some of these areas are actually easier to get people leading in because the skills, I think, are just more common in our group. So I have found more people can do deep in the Word and belonging in community because those 2 areas don't necessarily require a whole bunch of specialised technical skills or a kind of specialised gifting. I think probably serving others might fit in there as well. But the loving God area, I think, can be harder to find the leader who is really natively gifted for. And so if I find that person, I'll want to grab them because there are fewer of them. And same with mission. Having said that, so that's the basic principle. These guys, I think they're more common on the ground than these guys. Having said that, I think as you move up in the leadership levels, skill in any one area becomes less important than the ability to cast vision, to raise teams, and to develop other leaders. So we have 2 guys who together work in the loving God area. Dan is immensely capable musically, very gifted and really great at it. Zach, who works with him, actually, from what I know, can't hold a note and has never played an instrument, but is superb at building teams. The person we had doing it before those 2 guys, Sam Hilton, if you know Sam musically is just rubbish. If he was here, he'd say, amen. Spectacular at building teams. Spectacular at casting vision. And so probably if I was to boil your question down to one thing, what we're looking to do is to find leaders who will train, enthuse, equip, and envision groups of people, and we can overcome any native deficiencies they have in any one area. That's been our experience. Other questions? Yeah, great question. How do I guard against siloing? When we're bringing people on, I'll say, here are the 3 questions that I'm going to put to you in order. The first question is, do you want to be part of our church and belong to this flock with me as your pastor? Because everyone has to actually make that decision. The second question is, do you want to be part of this staff team with me as your leader, and do you want these guys and girls to be your colleagues and the people you're in the trenches with? The third question I'm going to ask you is, are you interested in this job? And that's in order of importance, because the church changes more slowly, and that's where I want their first allegiance to be. The staff team will change a little bit more quickly than the church, and I want their allegiance there. The job can change every single year in our context. And so if someone said, I want to join the team, but I'm only interested in working in this one area, I'd say, thanks, I'm not interested. I want shepherds of sheep. And the shepherd says, show me where the sheep need a shepherd. And so that for us, we've never really had a problem with siloing, but the one time it became an issue was when the person kind of said, look, I really don't like coming to staff meetings. I just want to get on with the job that you employed me to do. And I'd had that conversation, and I was like, but the job I employed you to do was actually just to love the whole church and to be part of the team. I'm really set on those three things. And you can see how the ecosystem thing fits in. Your job is to pastor the whole church first. Most of our staff, their job changes quite a lot year on year. All right, what I want us to do is there anyone who is feeling brave enough that you're going to bring, oh, look at that, a hand straight away. Good, why don't you come out? All right, now this is where I start backfilling and preparing for my failure. If we were doing this in our staff team, we would have everyone in the room who knows our church really well. I don't even, this is James and I, we've only just met. Have we met? Yeah. Which means, of course, we don't...
We had a long conversation last year,
That's right, you're my children's godparent. Yeah, okay. You're my brother, no. Normally in an ecosystem thing, we would all have the advantage of we know the situation, whereas what we're now going to be doing is relying on James to feed us the situation and for us to do some creative thinking. What we need to do is get you a mic. Scott's got it down there. One job. All right, James, can you describe the issue that you're wrestling with?
Yep. I think our growth groups are pretty mid. Mm-hmm. They're okay at each of the things that we ask of our growth groups, but they're also not great, and they're not necessarily hurting us too much.
Okay.
But I don't think they're really maximising and helping us as much as I would like them to.
Good. So if I'm to summarise that, do you want to press that down while I do this? You're feeling a problem here. Yep. And you say they're mid. In other words, what I hear you saying is they're not terrible, they're not dysfunctional.
Yep.
But not firing.
Yep.
If you were to go on a 1 to 4, 1 is really bad, 4 is humming, 2, it's functional.
Yep.
3 is pretty good.
Yep.
2 to 3.
So I'd say that they're doing the basics in terms of if you get a group of Christians to read the Bible together, good things are going to happen. Mm-hmm. But I'd say there's a lack of a discipleship culture and growth and really seeing people develop. That's not happening really well.
Great. Let's do OPPE within Deep in the Word. Mm-hmm. Would you say that historically there's been a passion for maturity, depth, the Word in church and in particularly that congregation if it's located in a congregation?
No, and our growth groups go across our congregation. So we can have congregation members in a growth group that aren't necessarily in the same congregation.
Okay, so it's multiple congregations. Yeah, sorry, so long-term, is there a culture for we love being in the Word together?
So previously we had a model of connect, grow, serve, but I think that that really got reduced down to join the church, join a growth group, join a service team, but not necessarily what does it look like long-term for me to develop as a Christian.
Okay, cool. In terms of the leaders, the person leading this area of church and the team, how would you describe, assuming the leader's not in the room, do you think that leader is healthy? The growth group leaders themselves, the small group leaders themselves, do you think that team is healthy? Do you have thoughts there?
I think that in that particular area, the person who's been responsible for it, it's really been myself and our adult ministries coordinator. She's not really super qualified in the Deep in the Word stuff. I haven't had a lot of time to give to it. We've just brought a new staff member on who is in the room to start to look at that. And so part of this is actually trying to figure out what's, how are we going to go at this and what are the best things for us to start working on.
How much time are you able to give to it across the course of, say, a month?
Maybe a day.
Okay, so 5%.
Yeah.
And what was the name of the lady who's helping you?
Andrea.
Andrea. How much time do you reckon Andrea is being able to do with it?
Probably, 4 days, maybe something like that.
Yeah. Okay, 4 days in a month.
So she spends a lot of time organising the growth groups in terms of how they operate, but not necessarily training and content and that sort of thing.
So around 20%. In terms of the material of what people do in growth groups and the kind of the way that they function, do you have thoughts around that?
Yeah, again, I think that's part of the problem. So my lack of time given to it is reflected in the material. But we've tried different things. So we've given them, a very generic sort of try this for every passage sort of thing. That hasn't really taken off. We've given them sort of stacks of cards to try and with different questions to play around with. We've given them sort of heavily noted studies with lots of leaders' notes and that sort of thing. So we're mixing it up. Yep. And none of them have sort of stuck in terms of, oh yeah, that was really great, or we feel good about that.
Would you say that the mixing up has led to a culture that, we try lots of different things, or maybe a culture of we're not quite sure what we do?
I think we're not quite sure.
Okay. Yep. So perhaps instability there. Do you measure, or have you set particular goals, numerical goals around your small group ministry, say in terms of the percentage of people who are in one, that sort of stuff?
No. So we know what the number is, which is about 70% of members are in growth groups, but we haven't set a particular target into what we're looking at.
Okay, but 70%, that's quite good, isn't it?
Yeah.
Do you have a sense of what their attendance week on week?
That's less clear. Our leaders have been reluctant to take attendance and give us that sort of data and that sort of thing.
It's often the way, isn't it? People feel like this is a big brother thing. It's quite hard to convince people that measuring things and counting things is actually that's how we show we love.
Yep.
Okay, so just as we look at it now, we have a sense that maybe there hasn't been it's not an entrenched culture that we love digging in the word together. And at the level of leader, you're obviously dragged in lots of different directions. Andrea is still only able to put about 20% of the time into it. Have we talked about what leadership training for the leadership team looks like, growth group leaders?
Yeah, so we've been working on this. So we have a system where we've got, so number of growth groups we have is over 20. And so we've got an extra level in there in terms of we have growth group coaches. They oversee about 4 or 5 groups each.
Brilliant.
So we've been developing them and sort of training them. I still also think though they're probably, they're growing. They're still figuring out what that job looks like for them and how to work with it and all that sort of stuff.
We found the same thing when we instituted that middle layer. It's just not a ministry that there's a template for. We know what leading a growth group looks like. What does it mean to be a coach? So we found the same thing. What that means is we may have already discovered 1 or 2 of the things that might help, and you're saying you've just placed somebody in here who's going to devote a lot more time to it. Probably that means that the coaches are going to get more time put into them and recruiting leaders, and probably helping that new person that you put in to really think into what is the program going to be. It could be that the problem is less an ecosystem problem and just part of that. The next thing we could do is say, do you have a sense that any of these other ministries are going so strongly that this one is being starved?
So this is my question on the ecosystem level and what I thought it was worth thinking about for this exercise. Andrew certainly wonders if too many of our talented leaders gets drawn into youth, and that one of the reasons that our growth groups are struggling is because of our charismatic, dynamic people head towards youth. And again, in the safety and security of this room, which is very small.
And we're filming it.
And we're filming it, all that sort of stuff.
People in Kazakhstan know the problems.
Yeah, that's right.
Right now.
We've tried to figure out, are our growth group leaders just introverted nerds that don't connect well in terms of actually teaching and that sort of stuff? Or do they come from a strong Bible study, like we read the Bible, we value the Bible, but they don't actually have the skills to apply that to people's lives and think and that sort of thing. And it could be because the people who are more capable of that are being diverted to different areas.
Very helpful, isn't it? Yeah, so it could be that you have a people group that's actually starving this group because they're competing for leaders. And what I would do in that next situation is sit down with that leader and with you and Andrea, and who's the new person coming on?
Isaac.
Isaac. And say, can we have a warm, loving, friendly, where we're all on the same team? Can we talk about, is this the problem? And look at who are the leaders and what do we think about their gifts? Let's do an honest, with a shepherd's eye, assessment of the quality of those leaders. Because that could be the ecosystem thing. Are there other ministry areas that you think are maybe drawing either leaders or time away? Yep, we've got 2 minutes.
Yeah, so I've thought about our training in general, because we haven't had a culture of maturing people. You know, we had a previous culture of they're great active church members, but not necessarily mature Christians. So we've been doing a lot of broader work in terms of running workshops to people across the board, and that's taking a lot of time and energy. And I'm wondering that as we're doing this, is this just a natural byproduct of as we try to get better at that and mature people across the board, we actually can't attack this one yet, and do we just have to sort of live with it for a little while until we get something else going?
Yeah. Yep, that could be it. A hunch. I imagine some of us are already wondering, if you have this ministry operating, how many congregations have you got?
2.
2 congregations. I wonder if it might be worth asking, because in any group, they're likely to only see, say, half the people in their group at church on a Sunday. Is that actually hindering their sense of community in groups? Is it time to move towards congregationally based growth groups, because then people can keep sowing into each other's lives? We're about to go through that experiment in our city congregation because people are going to be spread across 2. I wonder if that's worth exploring.
Yeah, it's a great question, because one of the values of the church has been having multi-aged growth groups. That's been something that's been valued, but is probably something that needs to be continually thought through. Like, is that going to be what's most effective for us? As much as some people love that.
Yep. That's really helpful, isn't it? And because what you've done is you've just identified you've got a value that is a really good one. It may actually be that you then have to either say, is that value going to work, or how do we maintain that value by doing something different in our program?
Yep.
Okay, that's really helpful. So what we've done is we've said the problem could be helped by just working in OPPE here. It could be just a problem in deep in the Word. It could be that we actually have a gathering issue, that growth groups or small groups are spread across various congregations. It could be that we actually have a people group thing, that the youth, which seems a long way away from growth groups, doesn't it? That youth is actually running too hot and therefore struggling. So there's an example of what do you do then? I think you keep having conversations, and eventually, without having absolute certainty, eventually you've got to pull a trigger.
Can we just give Greg some thank you round of applause, just to express some thankfulness?